Good morning. This is Father Fred here. I'm in New Braunfels at the house of my son Neil and his wife Lee. Their daughter Abigail is having a little graduation party. She just graduated from college. So we're having a real good time. I want to think back today a long time ago. Back during World War II, when supply of metal was very thin for ordinary things like fish hooks. The metal that would have gone into fish hooks today or before the war was going into tanks and armament for World War II. In the winter of 1944, the Palacios hardware store had run out of fish hooks. There wasn't a fish hook to be found. My Aunt Ida had loaned me a fish hook. I was down to my last one, but I lost it trying to pull a stingray out. She was down to 2 fish hooks, and they were important since fish were a much needed food supply for her and for many families in Palacios. No one in Palacios could match Aunt Ida's fishing ability, and she was teaching me her secrets. I was 6 years old and she was 60. Aunt Ida's younger sister was my grandmother, Lena Harrison. She, Ida, my mother, and I looked everywhere we could think of for fish hooks. My grandfather, who had died 2 years earlier, had several tackle boxes, but I had already removed the smaller bay fishing hooks from them, and we'd even used the larger ones. My father was in the Army, fighting in the South Pacific. He was from El Paso, out on the desert. He had no fishing tackle. There was little hope for new fish hooks at the hardware store, since all the metal was going into the war effort to build ships and tanks, guns, and the like. It's funny how important things like fish hooks can be when you really need them. Finally, we sat down and prayed for God's help in finding some proper fish hooks. A week later, in late January, a blue norther slammed into Palacios. The cold north wind howled all night. At the crack of dawn, my grandmother shook me awake. "Get up, Freddy," she said. "We're going after fish hooks. The fish are waiting." My mother bundled me up for the cold weather and kissed me goodbye. She had to stay behind with my little sister. Outside, my grandmother was lashing down my fishing pole over the top of her 1939 Buick. Aunt Ida was waiting in front of her tiny house, holding her fishing pole as we drove up. Soon we were down by the shore, and I looked out toward the bay in the dim light of dawn. Something seemed wrong. I looked at my grandmother. All I could say was, "No water." "That's right, Freddy," she said. "The north wind blew all of it out of the bay last night." "Where did it go?" I asked. "God knows," she said. "Just remember the Bible, when God cleared the way for the Israelites through the Red Sea." Aunt Ida had already removed her shoes and was sloshing through the mud toward an oyster reef that used to be out in the bay and now was just out in the mud flats. Aunt Ida was thin and very strong. My grandmother took her shoes off and walked out with me into the mud. She was a stout woman and sank to her knees right away. "See," she said, "I'm too heavy for this mud. You run and catch up with Ida. I'll wait in the car." I was light enough to run on the frozen surface of the bay mud, and soon Ida and I were loading our canvas grocery bags with hooks, wire leaders, lead weights, and fishing line that had been caught up in that oyster reef for years. Before long, we were fishing in a deep hole, and Ida's secret cold weather spot, where the big trout and redfish went when the water was blown out of the bay. We caught enough fish to feed our family and several other families as well. Those little hooks have provided a grand harvest. Samuel, a high priest in Israel, had been hasty when he anointed Saul the king of Israel. Saul turned out to be as evil and corrupt as Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Samuel prayed, and God told him to go to Bethlehem and find a new king among the sons of a man named Jesse. Now the sons of Jesse were all impressive-looking men. But then, Saul had seemed pretty impressive at first, before they found out what his true character was. Finally, Samuel asked Jesse if he had any other sons. "Well, yes," said Jesse, "little David, but he doesn't seem very kingly. He's out in the fields tending the sheep and goats. He's just an ordinary young herdsman." "Bring him in," said Samuel. As soon as Samuel saw David, he anointed him king of Israel. He was God's man and established a kingdom that lasted over 400 years. Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, was from that line of David. From small beginnings, God produces great results. When Jesus began his ministry, things weren't going very well for Israel. They had been under foreign rule for 600 years. People were often very negative about their prospects. They paid high taxes to the Roman Empire, and the Roman political appointees and soldiers were often arrogant and mean to them. 99% of the people were dirt poor and considered themselves fortunate if they lived beyond the age of 30 in good health and with their teeth. Jesus preached directly to this negative situation and told the people to love God and their neighbor. "If you do that," said Jesus, "if you have faith, the kingdom of God will fill your heart, and your faith will grow enormously, just like a mustard seed." "Then," said Jesus, "your life will reflect your faith." God works in many miraculous ways to increase our faith. It might be a cold north wind that blows the water out of a bay in Palacios, Texas, and uncovers fish hooks that are needed badly. It might be an unlikely king for Israel. These are the mustard seeds that grow us into the people of faith, the people of God. Thank you for being with me today. God bless you. Well, this little supplement is to introduce my granddaughter, Abigail Brown, called Abby. And Abby's been studying for the last few years in an international business program out of the University of South Carolina. And I wanted Abby just to let you know how many places she studied in the last 3 or 4 years as part of our international business program. Go ahead, Abby.
Perfect. Yeah. So I started out in South Carolina, went there for international business, graduated there with international business. But through the way, I had the opportunity to go over to China for a semester, which was incredible. And throughout that time, I got to study around Asia. So I went down to Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, made my way down to Australia, and then studied again in New Zealand for a couple months before I got sent home for COVID. But it was an incredible experience. The joy of travel is universal, and hopefully I can get back out there into the world soon.
Well, and also the biggest good news to me is that you have a job.
Right.
Where is that?
Yeah, so I'm moving to Nashville, Tennessee, working for an asset management company called Alliance Bernstein. Super excited. If anyone watching wants to come visit me in Nashville, just let me know. Look me up on Facebook. I'll reply through that. But yeah, super excited for my new journey and really excited for a new place.
Well, that's wonderful, Abby. Congratulations.
Thank you, Granddaddy.